Since 2016 and the election of President Donald Trump, the Electoral College has become a renewed area of interest for critics of this system looking to change the way that American elections, presidential elections to be specific, work. Elizabeth Warren has made this a central plank of her campaign, and since making a pledge that she as president would work to have the Electoral College done away with. This has now become something that you hear a lot from the Democratic candidates making the rounds on Morning Joe and CNN to audition for support as the nominee for 2020. On the other side, the Electoral College is sort of considered sacrosanct because it is alleged to preserve the role of rural areas and more or less keep cities, which are known to be blue, from dominating the presidential process. Now, this is up for debate. David Doerr of Young Voices recently wrote in the Washington Examiner that Elizabeth Warren is right to try to undermine the Electoral College, and this drew some attention from a Young Voices colleague by the name of Jacob Ritchie of the Reason Foundation, and he believes that things are good as is. So I brought them both on the podcast to discuss this, go over some of their points together, and give you a picture of the arguments for and against the Electoral College. David Doerr and Jacob Ritchie, thank you both for joining me today. David, you wrote in the Washington Examiner that Elizabeth Warren, one of the leading critics right now of the Electoral College and making the case publicly against it, sort of guiding many Democrats in the 2020 field into this issue and sort of campaigning and talking about needing to dismantle the Electoral College. Tell me a little bit about how you came to this conclusion and why you believe this.
Yeah, well, first of all, a thing I would say is that you mentioned in your introduction that the calls to abolish the Electoral College gotten most heated now. That's actually not necessarily true. There have been calls to get rid of the thing since the American founding. There was the idea of using a national popular vote that was mentioned a lot in the Constitutional Convention. I believe James Wilson, Pennsylvania, proposed it, and James Madison said that the people would be the most fit to elect the president. In 1824, after the first corrupt bargain, Andrew Jackson called for its abolition. So it's been in discussion for a while.
Yeah, well, we had a situation in 1800 with a tie on the Electoral College. I think that's the only instance, and that's something that maybe we'll bring up later. But yeah, there was definitely a case back then that this could lead to political instability in many ways.
Yeah, and so I think that in a lot of ways, we just assume it's a core part of the founding and that it can't be questioned. That's really not true, and that's really what I was going for, is that we need to be able to question what values institution brings. And I think in a lot of ways, it does not accomplish the goals it set out to accomplish. It's still proportioned by population, so large states still matter so much more than the smaller states. California has 55 electoral votes, Montana has 3. Rural areas still don't matter because cities still have the most people in one area. You hold your rallies in the cities because that's where you can get your message out to the most people. And just ultimately, it doesn't matter. And there's been around, I believe it's 4 elections. No, it's 5. 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016, where the winner of the Electoral College did not win the electoral vote. So just ultimately, it doesn't accomplish what it does, what people say it's going to accomplish, and it doesn't matter. So I don't see any reason to keep it around.
Jacob Ritchie, you got in on this conversation on Twitter. You disagree. I really would like to hear sort of your reaction to David saying that it doesn't accomplish the goals in which it's set out to accomplish, and it's also not some sort of sacrosanct issue, like it was not part of the American founding, and there's no need for us to act like it's not up for discussion. What do you think about that?
Well, much of my disagreement came because of particular specific things that were mentioned in the piece. First, he points out that Madison thought people were most fit to elect the president. Yes, I agree to that point, but Madison also, coming from Virginia, he happened to be the guy who proposed the Electoral College, and he basically designed it. So I'm not quite sure how much Madison actually wanted popular vote versus an electoral college, which is a method of allowing people to elect their president. The whole idea of the electoral college is to have people better fit to look over the information that would allow you to best pick a president, be in the position to do so. I think because the 10th Amendment delegated the powers of how electors are chosen to the states, and because the states have kind of picked a very, clumsy way of choosing electors, the original parts of the Constitution, what we would want basically the goal of the Constitution and having preferable, better people to choose the president does not actually exist. But it has nothing to do with the Electoral College existing. It's really just how each individual state has elected to elect its electors. And the reason why I truly disagree with the idea of getting rid of the Electoral College has really nothing to do with the main debate. Rural states, big states. It's really because it focuses on the swing states. And I think focusing on the swing states is the best way for us to elect our president, because focusing on the swing states means you're focusing on the states that are the most moderate. And having a moderate president is probably preferable. It basically allows our country to have incredibly polarized views on many topics, but for the majority of the rights that both sides want to have to exist. I mean, we have a country where we have the most liberal gun laws in the world and some of the most liberal abortion laws in the world. And I think that is a consequence of having an electoral college. And there's other things I want to mention, but that's probably the crux of my argument.
Yeah, well, to that, I think I'd say you mentioned that Madison did design the Electoral College, and that's true. But Madison had a long track record of opposing things in the Constitutional Convention, but then figuring out that it's the only way to make it happen. And so he took charge of creating it. Madison himself actually was one of those that opposed adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, even though he wrote the thing. But that was just because he knew that he couldn't get past anti-federalist support without adding it. And that's kind of similar to the Electoral College thing. And I'm not arguing, like some people argue, that the Electoral College is a disaster for democracy. I don't think that our country is awful because of the Electoral College. I think that it's just not useful. And you mentioned what I think is a very good point about focusing on swing states bringing forth moderate candidates, which I think is definitely true in this political climate. But I don't think it's inherently true that swing states are going to be the most moderate. If you want to look at some of the states that swung in 2016, Michigan was a swing state, my home state. And in the primary, that went for Bernie and Trump, who I wouldn't say would be the more moderate candidates in the races. So I think that is a claim that we need a bit more empirical support behind it.
No, I want to push back on that. I think Michigan is an incredibly moderate state. I went to school there. I was right down the street, a big street, but right down the street at Eastern Michigan while you were at Hillsdale. Yeah, I mean, it's a state that has incredibly liberal union, liberal abortion, lots of liberal laws everywhere. But it also happens to be an open carry state. I mean, it's really one of the best mixtures of what a typical American state would look like. If you were going to offer a state to basically represent the entire country and just say, what does a middle median type of person look like? I think someone from Michigan, someone from Ohio, someone from North Carolina, the typical swing states is probably the best representation of what moderate policies look like. And both of those states, all the states I just mentioned, tend to have governors and elected officials that also are deemed to be more moderate. So.
What do both of you think of the rising sort of discontent and controversy that surrounds the Electoral College? Because you mentioned, sort of moderate candidates coming from whichever states, and states' abilities to moderate that themselves. And my thought is that our politics have just gotten to be so disgruntled and populist that the Electoral College is sort of a source of part of that wound that we sort of just kind of keep coming back to. And I think that was sort of one of the premises of David's piece, was that the only purpose it seems to serve is for controversy and division. Is there, under those grounds, do we need to reassess it, or sort of just keep telling the American population, it's okay, you don't understand the system, it's good for you, and then just hope that everything works out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're completely right there. Every time that there's been a candidate that won in the Electoral College but lost in the popular vote, there's been loads of controversy around it. 1824, first corrupt bargain. 1876, second corrupt bargain. 1888 was plagued with accusations of electoral fraud in states like New York. 2000 obviously had the hanging Chad incident stuff. And 2016, we all know what happened after that. And I just don't think that any value we get from more moderate figures, even if we take that claim at its face value, outweighs that sort of discontent the system creates.
Yeah, I kind of want to push back against that too. I will definitely concede that when the Electoral College is the deciding factor and the popular vote is basically thrown to the side and it's solely dictated by the Electoral College, when that happens, we definitely see a little bit more division. But I don't think that has anything to do with the Electoral College and because people are mad that an insufficient system elected their president. I think it has everything to do with it just being a close election. And every time we have a close election, people just tend to get mad. And if their side loses and they thought that they had a good chance of winning, or they worked really hard and they were really close to getting the person in office they wanted to, but they didn't, I think that has much more to do with the dysfunction and polarization than the fact that it was an Electoral College that does it. I think the only people that really get mad at the Electoral College are the people who happen to lose at that moment. And then the people who win are like, yay, Electoral College. You know what I mean? But the whole idea that the Electoral College even gives an advantage to one party, I think is a little misguided, because if the Electoral College did not exist, the whole strategy to being elected president would change. So you would have completely different methods of trying to acquire votes. And I would just say that it's coincidental that the Republicans happen to be the ones who understood winning the Electoral College rather than the popular vote is more important, and have just had better strategies in the last 20 years.
I think of the Electoral College as being part of sort of a real war in American culture today with our original values, sort of our guiding principles as a country. And just the idea that, one person should have one vote, and in a democratic system, everybody should be able to go to the polls with equal power. The Electoral College sort of seems to distort that. It can ascribe, a person in one given state 3 votes to a person who may, technically by the math, have 1 in another state. Jacob, what do you sort of make of that criticism of the Electoral College?
That criticism is incredibly valid. It definitely gives swing states more say in who is elected president. Actually, let me go farther. It only gives the swing states a say in who's going to be elected president. And that's not even a design of the Electoral College necessarily. That's actually a design of how the states have basically collectively decided how they're going to distribute their electoral votes. I read through the Constitution a little bit trying to prepare for this, and I don't think there's anywhere in the Constitution that says that a state has to give all of its electoral votes for one presidential nominee versus another. I don't think that exists. I think it's actually just in the states that they just do that. And and because that's how it's done, and because people aren't able to choose their electors, basically the states have been infiltrated by the political parties. And the political parties have convinced the states that whoever wins, their political party gets to choose the elector. And then the electors get to choose the president. And I think that's ridiculous. I don't even think we should have a popular vote. I think you should be electing your elector and basically discussing with your elector, who happens to live in your community, who has no other government office because of the Constitution. The Constitution demands that. And you can actually have a discussion with him, and he can actually inform you on who is going to be elected president. I think that's actually the original intention of the Constitution. Yeah, since the fact that the states give an all or nothing approach to their distribution of elector votes to the president at the end of the day, people in California have no say. People in Mississippi have no say. It's only the states that have a chance of fluctuating. But, we actually do get an advantage of that because the states have decided that they're going to give an all or nothing approach to their electors. You've basically coincidentally had what I'm going to reverberate again is the most moderate policies being debated and the most moderate policies being championed. And in a world where I kind of worked at a libertarian think tank and I like the least intrusive government possible, I kind of like the idea that the majority of rights that both sides seem to cherish seem to still be here. And if we got rid of the Electoral College and the presidents were able to pander to incredibly extreme rhetoric and propose extreme proposals, I fear that it would be much different. And I think that actually separates us from much of the world. There's very few countries in the world, if any, that have a way of electing their big leader that we do. I mean, and there's very few countries in the world that really get to benefit from the types of freedom we have. And just trying to mess with the system, I think is dangerous, and I don't really see an advantage to it. And I don't think the opposition has really given a good reason to get rid of it. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
David, I think that begs a response. Is it dangerous to dismantle this?
I would say that the system definitely does encourage states to give a winner-take-all system, because the Electoral College arose from a compromise between national vote and Congress, because states that had high population but low eligible voters wanted to have more power in the system. Under the Electoral College, Virginia, I believe, was the most powerful state in terms of selecting the president. It's not a coincidence that all but one of the first 5 presidents comes from Virginia. And then destroying the Electoral College is dangerous, and I'm not sure I agree with that. In fact, I know I don't, because we still collect national popular vote data. Like, we have the numbers right there. And you mentioned that people are running their campaigns differently. I'm not convinced that's true either. Trump says that he did, but he was campaigning in California. He held rallies there, and everyone was laughing at him for it. So I think he just happened to have a demographic in the Midwest that was able to propel him in. And then going back to the moderate things, I'm not sure. You mentioned that it's supposed to prevent candidates from rising to power on top of extreme rhetoric, but I don't see how else you can classify Trump rather than someone shouting off extreme rhetoric and getting elected on top of a highly motivated base. I think as things are right now, we're too partisan. People are going to vote for whoever has the correct letter next to their name, and its policy doesn't matter.
Right in front of me, I have a map, and it has June 2015 through June 2016 of Trump holding rallies. And maybe Trump did end up visiting California after June, but I don't see a single rally in California for Trump, at least between June 2015 and June 2016. And if you look at where he's visiting, it is disproportionately all of the swing states. Yeah, that's exactly what I see right in front of me. I mean, North Carolina, Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Iowa. I mean, the biggest swing states, and Wisconsin, the state that no one thought that he was going to be able to pull. I mean, he's all over the place there. I really just want to push back on the idea that the Electoral College does not change the strategy of the president, because I think it clearly does.
And so you're saying that he goes to swing states, and these are inherently moderate states. I'm in North Carolina. We're known for being quite purple.
Yeah, in fact, I'm looking at North Carolina right now. It's like in the top 2 to 3 states that he visited. It's like North Carolina, Ohio, Florida, what he visited the most. And those happen to be the states that swing the most as well. I mean, they're ones that voted for Bush, Obama, and Trump. That's as swingy as you get. So, yeah, and there's a reason why he's disproportionately looking at those states. I think it's obvious that the strategy of presidents is definitely to pander to the swing states. And pushing back on the moderate idea, okay, I think that's a good discussion to have. But I think it certainly affects the strategy of the presidents and the rhetoric they propose.
David, I'm up against a time crunch, but I want to give you the last word here.
Yeah. Let's see. You asked the question about the historical reasons for the Electoral College and the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, if you think it's relevant to sort of making a point about why it's no longer important or relevant for the country.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important. There's a reason I didn't focus on it too much, because then with the Electoral College being tied to slavery, you run the risk of having people think your argument boils down to the Electoral College is racist and so it should be abolished. And I'm not arguing that at all. But how the Constitutional Convention worked out is that it created a way for states with high populations to retain a lot of power. If you remember the 3/5 compromise, where African American slaves counted as 3/5 of a people, that was done to appease Southerners who wanted their slaves to count as full people, because that would increase the voting power they get in Congress, and in the Electoral College. And so James Wilson, Pennsylvanian, up there proposed national popular vote, and the Southerners, who were already more pro-British than the North, wanted a system where they would be able to keep the balance against the North, even though they had less voters. So a lot of them proposed that Congress appoints the president. And I believe it was Madison who said that national popular vote was dead because it doesn't help the South. They have a high population, but so much of that is enslaved labor that's not able to vote. So that's the basic rundown of it.
All right, that is all we were able to get from David Doerr and Jacob Ritch in this conversation on the Electoral College. I hope it was eye-opening, enlightening to you in some way as you sort of figure out the arguments for and against the Electoral College and come to a decision for yourself about what the merits of this process are for deciding the presidential elections. You can follow David on Twitter at David Doerr with 2 R's in the end, David Doerr 1. And you can follow Jacob Ritch at Jacob James Ritch on Twitter. That's Jacob James Ritch. Lots of good stuff on there. Highly recommend you follow the both of them. And myself on Twitter at Stephen_Kent89. That's Stephen with a PH _Kent89. And Young Voices at YVADV. You can find out more about Young Voices online at www.young-voices.com. Find out how to join Young Voices yourself. Join our ranks. Become a contributor. We are always taking applications at young-voices.com/apply. You can find the apply tab at the top of the website. And we would love to see your application and gauge your interest in becoming a Young Voices contributor. That is all for the Young Voices podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Kent, and we'll be back next week with more. Until then, stay free.